Tom choked on his tea.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Are we not being candid and honest academics yet?
Jama reached over and poured himself more tea into the small cup.
I asked why such a good 5 or 10% of humans seem determined to be such ungrateful little bitches. Though, given your world favours men, would it be better if I said ungrateful bastards?
Tom set his tea down and looked over at Jama, who only arched an eyebrow as he sipped his tea. Jama had been unfeigningly polite, affable, and interested when they met, and though the conversation had taken an unpleasant turn, Tom had the feeling he was being tested. Fuck it. If I'm wrong, I can tell him to go screw himself and leave. Maybe it has something to do with the wave of death you caused in saying hello, he said tersely, picking up his cup of tea.
I'll admit, including my wife and daughter, he snapped.
Jama set his tea down, clearly shaken, but didn't look away.
All right, lad, I'll give you that's a damn fine reason and no mistake. I've read as much as I can about things before and after, and I'll grant you it should have been done differently. But you're a part of us and citizens of the Imperium now. The Imperium is doing as best it can.
I've seen and read about some of the nobles doing the best they can on Earth. They should be in prison. Tom took a deep breath and very deliberately unclenched his fists. Candid is as candid does, Jama.
True. Candid is as candid does. And there's more than a few nobles who are spending the rest of their days in prison now. I expect you know that too, Jama said mildly, before reaching over and topping up Tom's cup.
It was a tacit invitation to continue talking, and Tom took the hint. A hard test, then, but maybe no worse than what he'd done with Desala that morning. He was pondering that as Jama broke the silence.
I do want to apologize about your wife and child. I know I can't make it right, but I am sorry.
Tom realized he'd been clenching his teeth and ran his tongue over them, forcing his jaw to relax as he picked up the fresh cup. It's not something I want to talk about. I don't intend to be seen as some wounded soul while I'm teaching here, but I'll accept the apology all the same.
You know, I've been looking over some of the course material that you've been teaching these last 2 weeks. Ganya sent it to me while I was coming in system and asked what I thought.
The older man chuckled at Tom's look of surprise.
I told her that sometimes education needs to have a little bit of bite in it, but you didn't sound like some wild-eyed radical either.
Well, that's very kind.
So, indulge me, lad. You had a section about people called carpetbaggers.
Yes. Right after the American Civil War, there were a bunch of opportunists who came in during the Reconstruction to exploit the local populace for their own financial, political, or social gain. And Tom trailed off as the parallel crystallized in his mind.
Oh. Lad, I'm sorry the galaxy came calling, and we aren't as good as you hoped.
Jama shifted in his chair and frowned.
I've never worried about someone saying treason just for saying the Imperium isn't perfect, and I'm too old to start. But I expect we're all going to have to wait for the next incarnation for a universe filled with rainbows and philanthropists.
Tom sipped his tea. It was bitter, but it was growing on him. That's candid. Jama barked out a laugh that would have sounded at home on a much younger man.
If you want pride and patience, you talk to a Zavastutan. For a dour and candid, you talk to a Cambrian.
You sound like a Scot, Tom said with a rueful smile.
I'm not sure what that is, but you can bet I'll be looking it up later. He returned a cheery smile of his own. You know, we really are going to have to sit down and talk about convergent evolution sometime. You're a lot like us. Remarkable. Really, just remarkable.
Biology isn't exactly my field. I can tell you what I know. Tom said uncertainly, but stopped as Jama waggled a finger at him. You said you wanted candid, so fair's fair. Ganya said you're on at least a 3-year contract, so I expect we'll have more than a little time for conversation. Jama clapped his hands and laced his fingers together. You said you wanted to know about all of this. I'd love to, he nodded back. I was looking over some of the objects in your office, and I'm curious. Right then, let me start with some candid questions. Tom set his tea back and crossed his legs, thinking it over. As honest academics? All right, shoot. Shoot? Sorry. It's a turn of phrase. It means go ahead. Tom thought about the expression on Jama's face. Great, I may have just marched humanity down a fraction of a percent for violence. He's old, but he's sharp as a knife. As attack. Fuck. Interesting turn of phrase, Jama said slowly, and gave Tom a penetrating look as he pressed on. So we put the survival of humanity at around 50%. That's neither here nor there, but would you say you had some significant problems that threatened your world? That's fair. I'll admit that. And you've heard what I said about the Ujarans being our first confirmation of life in the galaxy? More or less. Tom glanced in the direction of the door and thought about the statue in the foyer. Yes. I expect you even spared a thought or two for how that shaped our views on nuclear weapons, and the species that have them. Jama looked at him expectantly. Tom wondered how the elderly shill would handle the Socratic method. Just at the moment, it seemed he'd do just fine. Well, that makes sense, yes. And you hoped that the first civilization to cross your path would lift you up, solve all your problems, ask for nothing in return, and turn you loose on the galaxy while you were pointing enough nuclear weapons at each other to turn your planet into glass. Tom opened his mouth and closed it again. He didn't have an answer for that one. Honest, candid, or otherwise. I'm sorry, young man. I can't seem to hear your answer over the sound of your preconceptions crashing. Tom chewed on that and thought harder. The Shorvalti aren't exactly pacifists. You are well acquainted with the concept of self-defense. You have massive space fleets, so you can't tell me that you invaded only because us poor savannah apes had sharp pointy things aimed at one another. All right. Continue, young man. You said all of this has to do with the Ujarans. How it made an impact on the Shorvanti even before you had spaceflight. So it's not just a case of proactive self-defense. We're talking about this now. Tom waved his hand at the room, with its collection of dusty curiosities. You mentioned the Imperium's Uplift program, too. Very good. Go on. Jama nodded. Tom looked past Jama at the shelves behind him, where a collection of iridescent cones decorated with something like wings stood in an arrangement. He took a guess. So you're saying that this whole collection is made up of walls that didn't make it? I'm saying that before you can fix your problems, you have to understand that you have them. If your whole race were like you, lad, I expect we'd have rated you at better than 50%. But we literally knew from the start that not every race is like that. You mentioned those formulas of yours earlier. Tom thought for a second. The Drake equation and the Fermi paradox? Yes, those. Jama nodded vigorously. That last part you mentioned, the percentage of intelligent life that survives its own technology, would you care to guess what that was before the Imperium? Tom licked his lips and thought about the rows upon rows of cases in the hall, beyond the office. I'm guessing you're going to say there's a depressingly low rate of survival. Too right by half there, the elderly man said quietly, before slapping the arms of his chair, dispelling the mood that threatened to take over the conversation. With technological races that the Imperium has found inside our borders, it's now less than 1%. That seems... Tom chose his words carefully. Excuse me for saying so, but after my experiences during the invasion, that seems suspiciously low.
Fair enough, fair enough.
Jarmer started to pour himself some tea and frowned, as the pot was empty.
Right, let's run through it while I make a bit more tea. Would it surprise you to learn there are easily thousands of species inside the Imperium's borders?
I saw a lot of different races at the spaceport, but without anything else to go on, I guess. Yes, I am surprised.
No more surprised than we were by humans.
Jarmer looked back over his shoulder as he set the carafe on the counter and started measuring out some tea.
You may not know it, but by almost any standard, Earth is insane. I don't mean the people, lad, I mean your planet. Absolutely fucking nightmarishly hostile by any standard worth talking about.
What? Earth is... well, it just is.
Don't try and fool me. I've had a look at your world, he said, waving part of some device back at Tom. Our people took one look at a place on your equator called Darien. It's lush, verdant, and we thought that it would be sprouting resorts in 10 years, only to find out it's home to some of the most savage wildlife we've ever seen, coexisting in one spot. Just on top of it, in planetary terms, is a place you call the Atacama Desert. The place is so arid our people needed ventilators just to step outside, though at least there are no humans there to speak of, either. You talk to any of our biologists, and they'd tell you it's a miracle anything sentient survived in your world.
So, humans are adaptable. Tom watched as Jarmer poured the tea in. Alright, so that was a Shilvanti kettle, and turned back to face him, as the carafe steadily filled. What's that have to do with it?
Everything, young man, everything.
Jarmer shook his hands at Tom.
The galaxy is filled with living worlds, teeming with them, even. But most worlds with apex predators are still so stable that there isn't a push towards sapience, and when you do get it, most species tend to get along quite handily, staying roughly at the Bronze Age. We found most species that moved on towards real technology had an environment that gave them a push, but Earth is rather, robust.
Alright. So a lot of worlds have life, and most don't develop full sentience. Tom walked that through. Given how many species on Earth possess near-human intelligence, and even use tools from apes to dolphins to parrots, even demonstrated levels of self-awareness, Mother Nature and the Turing test have been poking holes in humanity's self-satisfaction for a while. So, a galaxy full of life, but most sapient species don't become technological. And you're saying the Imperium has changed the game for survival in technological civilizations. Tom watched as Jarmer brought the fresh carafe back to the table. I thought you weren't trying to sell me on the Imperium being perfect, but I'll accept that the Imperium isn't just about being interstellar carpetbaggers, if you tell me what you think it's all about. Jarmer looked surprised as he considered the question.
Well, it's about long-term survival, isn't it? Diversity creates strength, so diversity is important to the Imperium.
As a citizen of a new member world, you'll excuse me if I have some trouble seeing it, Tom said, neutrally. In the grand scheme of things, diversity sounds nice, but the Imperium hasn't exactly embraced everyone equally, and the nobility certainly likes things just as they are. Hell, the entire Imperium more or less likes the way it's made.
Please, I've been following some of your work, and you won't bait me into thinking you're that naive.
Jarmer poured himself another cup and looked inquisitively at Tom.
After all, we've never irradiated ourselves, and I'm from Cambria. In fairness, the Imperium is doing the heavy lifting, so I think we're allowed some leeway.
Tom picked up his tea and pondered it, thankful the cups were so small. The conversation had gone in unexpected directions, but at least he hadn't had to ask where the bathroom was. Alright, let's say I just accept all that at face value. What does it have to do with all of your collection out there? Jarmer canted his head as he looked at Tom, the thumb on his left hand rubbing his fingers for a time.
I suppose this is where I ask if you want to hear about our virtues or our flaws, isn't it? You've been candid with me when I pressed, young man. I see no reason not to respond in kind.
Tom mulled that over. It seemed uncharacteristically straightforward, but the conversation about humanity from a different perspective hadn't been entirely flattering. I think I've had enough about flaws for a little bit. You have cases and cases showing dead civilizations. I'm not sure what the good news is, but I like to hear some. The little Shorvanti closed his eyes and leaned his head back in the chair for a long moment. When he spoke, it was a steady cadence. Mourn not for us, for we have known the light, have looked on beauty, have lived in peace and loved. Grieve but for those who go alone, unwise, to die in darkness, and never see the sun. Tom watched as Jama pinched the bridge of his nose. His eyes still shut, but he was certain there was a trace of a tear that the Shorvanti wiped away before looking at him. I don't understand, Jama. In the case nearest this office, there's an exhibit from a world we call Xanas. It was the third dig I'd been on, and we found those worlds. It was the inscription we found inside the outer vault. Jama was pointing out the door of his office, but his expression spoke of someone lost in a distant and bitter memory. Their system never had any other worlds of appreciable size, so they never developed meaningful spaceflight. They lived, loved, created a vital civilization of incomparable beauty and kindness. And then, roughly 6,000 years ago, their sun started to flare. They knew their atmosphere was going to be ripped away in a few years, but they saved it. All of it that they could in a vault and set a beacon. No notion of what was out in the galaxy, but they did it all the same. If there were a people worth saving, it was certainly them. And in cosmic time the Imperium missed doing it by a blink of an eye. Do you know what the worst part was? The very worst? The very idea shook Tom. The loss seemed beyond calculation, and he shook his head, mutely. In the last vault, the deepest one, we found the seed banks. A full genetic library. Everything that might be needed to start their world again. Somewhere else? We also found the bodies of 11 Xanasi. They died without violence. As far as we can tell, they starved to death. Starved to death in a vault full of grain. Not one container opened, not one seed spilled. All in the hope their world could live again. They starved to death. Tom set his tea down. His hands were shaking, though he managed not to spill the tea. As he looked at Jama, the man seemed to come back from where he was so many years before. We petitioned the Science Directorate, of course. At my age, I made it something of a last crusade, and now it's going to happen. If all goes to plan, the project will start in 2 more years to try and birth the first clones on a colony world. They saved their culture, their records, and art. It's been my fondest wish to be alive to see it, and their civilization will live again. I have to admit, when you lead with good news, you don't go in for half measures. Jama barked out another laugh and smiled. Yes, well, it's not alone at least. Someday you might get to meet a race called the Imperial, you know. You mean there's another species that you brought back from extinction? Tom was staring now, trying to wrap his mind around the scope of it all. Oh, no. If it weren't for these nasty bodies we found so far below the surface and their gene bank, it would have been quite out of the question. A unique set of circumstances, you see. No, the Imperial we found in another isolated system. A red dwarf, actually. Their world was isolated and right at the end of its life cycle, when it finally developed sentient technological life. The Imperium is moving some of the population to 3 new colonies. I dare say if humanity continues to adapt,
the Imperium will offer a colony world soon enough. Good for species survival. Anyway, then there's a species calling themselves We That Survive. Quite remarkable. 3 centuries ago, we found they'd fled their homeworld on generation ships. Generation ships, of all things. By the time we found them, they passed through 8 star systems still looking for a habitable world. An entire civilization fighting to survive, and travelling below the speed of light, no less. Simply remarkable.
Those are living species, then, Tom said slowly. It was sort of work that spoke of more benevolence than he'd often granted the Imperium, but given the people he'd met, and the incredible resources at his disposal, was it so hard to believe? Jama, those are dead worlds out there. Tell me honestly, how many of those are worlds at the hands of the Imperium?
Ah, now that is a rather direct question.
The archaeologist peered at him.
If I were your age, that's a question I would take some care in asking, you know. Imperfections aside, the Uplift program has done quite well, but some matters touch on a nerve. It wouldn't do to ask that of the wrong person at the wrong time, and it's not like the Imperium was first on the scene. There have been giants in the playground before us.
Since it's just us here, and right now, let's assume this isn't the wrong time and you want the wrong person, Tom said slowly, as he filed that away.
That is an assumption you should always make with great care, young man. Great care.
Jama looked at him warily, as he continued.
The answer is 4. I'm pleased to say that it used to be 5, but a few years ago, I was able to send the Nixian exhibit back to our anthropology department. It should be 5, but the actual count is 4.
4? And should be 5? Would you care to explain that?
There was a race on a system called Hanalesh. Parasitic, utterly xenophobic, and after we lost our 3rd contact team in circumstances too gruesome to go into, the Imperium took action. There was a world in the Anrasa system, covered almost entirely by, well, an organism, and it did produce coherent radio transmissions. Our survey team was absorbed. Jama was looking at Tom intently, and his gaze had no trace of regret. The Grand Sheev were almost extinct when we discovered them, dying of a bioengineered weapon they unleashed upon themselves in a war. The plague was so toxic that the Imperium determined there was no hope of finding a cure, and the risk of contagion was unacceptable. In fairness, the remaining Grand Sheev were in agony, and asked for their own end. The last incident was over 20 years ago, and not at the behest of the Imperium. The noble in question paid rather dearly.
Tom looked at his host and tried to consider all the factors that could go into choices like that. It was a calculation of survival, but when did it stop being murder? That's 4. You said it should be 5?
Yes, the Ulnus. Over countless centuries, I think the Imperium has done a rather good job, with all the civilizations it saved.
Jama's mouth worked in distaste.
I think it's fair to say we've done our best, but we have made one mistake.
A mistake? Even on Earth we heard of the Ulnus. Your people call them the Roaches. We heard the Imperium turn their world into so much floating rubble.
Tom, the Imperium is most certainly not in the habit of genocide. On those occasions the Imperium has encountered worlds too dangerous to join civilization. The policy has been in favour of orbital bombardment, to reduce the local population towards a lower social level that doesn't present a threat.
You mean you bombed them back into the Stone Age?
Tom knew his mouth was hanging open.
You call that civilization?
My dear fellow, by definition, any civilization is literally just a consensus. It only exists and has certain goals because there's a consensus that says so. The consensus of the Imperium is to survive and prosper. All of its citizens want to do that, and I seriously doubt humanity is an exception.
Jama paused before taking another sip, to peer at him, and asked, "Would you not take a life to save the lives of others? Is it so inconceivable that in a century or so, a human commander on an Imperial mission will give the order to end one world, to save 1,000? Tom's memories pull forth the image of a man sitting across a desk in a small room, half a lifetime ago. It had been his interview for the Air Force Officer Training School, and while he'd long forgotten the Major's name, he could still recall his face. He could certainly recall the question, if given the order, could you launch a nuclear weapon? Tom thought back to the answer of a much younger man, who was himself. "I'll have some more tea, thanks." Tom had left Professor Hamaris's chambers with more questions than answers, easy or hard. The elderly Shorvanti hadn't pulled any punches, and after returning to his rooms, Tom donned a thick t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants with his trunks on underneath. He was tempted to head down to the beach where Miv would be running, but that covered a lot of territory. Getting in a swim down at the pool would be a far better way to blow off steam, and he was humming a tune as he made his way down from his apartment, nodding to passing students and faculty alike. Watching the diving practice a few days before had been stunning. The Shorvanti might not be built for running, but by God, they were at home in the water. He knew he wasn't any judge, but at the time, it felt like even the first year's trying out would have been stiff competition for the Olympics. Despite it being open hours, he saw no one around the pool and offered his towel on a chair before tugging off the sweats. Fall in this hemisphere was only supposed to be a few weeks, but it was still hot as perdition. Tom didn't even want to think about actual summer. Mivere had called it the rainy season. He hadn't touched much of his pay, but he hadn't even been off campus. With no idea how much money he had, or how far it would spend, it wasn't really possible to plan a vacation somewhere nicer. Accepting any of the invitations he'd been given was not very appealing. Still, if nothing presented itself, he could look forward to living in a sauna. It was a problem for another day, with some time to go. Something to talk over with Miv, at least. For now, it felt like a nice day in Miami in summer. He was next to a pool the size of a football stadium, and life was good enough. Tom dove into the waters and kicked up to the surface, closing his eyes and feeling the heat. The pool was warm, but far cooler than the air, and just right for a relaxing swim. A few laps back and forth across the centre to get in shape would be just right. It should have been. Closing his eyes, he crossed freestyle to the other side, taking it slow and trying to enjoy the exercise. It wasn't as easy as he hoped. The swim was fine and the water felt wonderful. It was his thoughts that wouldn't leave him alone. Decades before, a much younger Tom, sitting there saying he would follow a legal order to fire a nuke, follow the chain of command. Seen in black and white, it was monstrous. In the reflection of years and light years, was being willing to accept the order any more virtuous than being the person that actually had to carry out the order? Maybe a monster didn't see a monster when they looked in the mirror. It seemed like a fine hair to split. The whole world was invaded by Shorvanti, and now here he was in another world, fallen hard for a Shorvanti woman, and trying to teach them to treat humanity with something like respect. Tom stopped swimming halfway across the pool, treading water and closing his eyes as he wrestled with it all. God, am I just being a fucking hypocrite? What do you mean, Professor? Ah! Had he been on land, Tom would have leapt a foot in the air. As it was, he flowed and spun awkwardly towards the voice just behind him. Bobbing a few feet away, Sci-Fi Detain looked as surprised as he felt. Oh, sweet. Sci-Fi, you scared the hell out of me. Sci-Fi looked apologetic, and backed a foot or two away. I'm sorry.
Are you alright? I know it's open time here. I mean, I didn't want to scare you. Maybe it was just the look on her face, but Tom didn't feel under threat. In fact, his demeanour was probably alarming the girl more than his initial shock. It's alright, you just surprised me. I was so wrapped up in my thoughts I didn't hear you dive in. Oh, I didn't. I was underneath you the whole time, she said proudly. Deep diving practice. I can hold my breath a lot longer, but for that kind of thing you really need a spotter. Tom glanced down in spite of himself, remembering the depth of the pool. It was easily as deep as it was large, and some of those girls had gone deep. It's alright, really. I was just getting out. I think you just helped me clear my head for a bit anyway, he said, as he dog-paddled over to the side of the pool and grabbed the side. Scifi swam like a fish not far from him, and he felt about as graceful as a drunken moose, but as she noticed, Scifi had the tact not to say anything. Pulling himself up to sit on the edge of the pool, he looked back to Scifi, who kept her distance warily. Tom only nodded to his side. Come on out. I doubt you're going to turn into the creature from the Blue Lagoon on me. What? Scifi looked confused. Back when I was your age, there was a very old film about a creature from the depths called The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Scifi's face clouded over like she'd been struck, and he hastily pressed on. There was also a film called The Blue Lagoon. Starred a young woman who melted hearts for the next 40 years. I'm sorry. Just mixing my metaphors pretty badly there. Scifi pulled herself out of the water without making a ripple, and looked up at him, brightening. So you think I think you're a very attractive young lady, and if my world were a little greener, you'd probably be breaking hearts as soon as you step foot on it. You really think so, Professor? Scifi beamed and struck a pose, arching her back just a bit, and Tom felt the temperature of chill a bit more acutely than he had a moment before. Put you in a bikini and you can cause a riot, Tom nodded, as he towed off his hair. Bikini? Oh, human swimwear for women, just a cultural thing, he shrugged. Scifi was clad in what seemed the usual Shorvanti swimsuit of choice, which fit like a wetsuit, that cut off at the elbows and knees. It looked utterly practical for diving or swimming, and it wasn't hard to envision a tool belt turning it into a working garment. Neat. Scifi gave it a moment's thought and seemed to file it away, before looking back with concern. Professor Warwick, is everything alright, though? What you said in the pool sounded, Tell you what. For the next however long we're sitting here, pretend you're a third year and just call me Tom. It's hard to feel like a professor when you're dripping wet, and Mr. Warwick never really suited me. He paused, watching as Scifi settled into a chair some distance away. Shorvanti notions of personal space between women and men still took getting used to. I guess it's fair to say I've had a couple of things on my mind after this morning's class, and a conversation I had this afternoon made it worse. Whatever it is, it can't be that bad, can it? She asked earnestly. I suppose not. Probably not, really, but the more miles you get behind you, the more baggage you get, too. I lost, well, some things, when your people arrived on my world. Now here I am, trying to be a teacher. All I keep hearing is a song in the back of my head, playing on repeat, while I'm stuck thinking about what I should have said today. When I get a song in my head, I usually have to listen to it a bit before I can get it out, or else I have to wait until something else catches my ear. Scifi brushed the long bangs of her pixie cut back behind her ear, and peered at him. What's it about, anyway? My back pages? I suppose it's asking questions, and I'm not sure about my answers. Mongrel dogs who teach, fearing not I become my enemy in the instant that I preach. I'm unsure trying to explain who humans are while I'm dealing with all the changes. I really enjoy being here, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit it's been a lot of change in a very short time. He sighed. Lies that life is black and white. It's the kind of thing you always think you know,
and then life throws you a hell of a reminder. I had one this afternoon. Well, the goddess killer says if you're in pain from the outside world, remember the pain can have less to do with the thing itself and more with your estimate of it. Know yourself and don't give it power over you. Tom looked down the commons and out to the ocean. Scifi, it sounds like Killer knows what she's talking about.